The reader's pages Flair's title reigns. A few more notes on my arguments for Ric Flair being a 22-time world champion. First, when putting together the list, I set a few ground rules. First, I totally removed the physical belt from the argument altogether. If you go on the logic that the NWA and WCW titles were one and the same simply because public perception was based on who wore the identifying belt, then couldn't you also make the case that Vader, Nobuhiko Takada and even Mark Fleming could be considered former NWA World Heavyweight Champions since they all at one time or another wore the belt that Luthez wore in the 50s? Also, I kept asking myself, would this, if push came to shove, hold up in court? Since the NWA did, from a legal standpoint, exist as an organization, although in 1991 it was inactive and the other members had no real power to bargain with, I look at the separation between the two groups and their individual titles from a legal standpoint as opposed to how it was perceived by wrestling fans at the time. I guess I can see your point as to why you wouldn't separate the titles during that time period. As for the Midnight Rider switch, according to the reports, NWA President Bob Geigel was also the special referee for the match and the actual stripping of the title was done the following week on television. Dan Billings' newsletter Wrestling Rights stated that Geigel made the comment that if Rhodes didn't unmask, his victory would be stricken from the record books. However, I vividly remember after this happening that Gordon Soley on Georgia Championship Wrestling not only continuously referred to Rhodes as a 3-time champion but Flair as a 2-time champion. If you go back to the tape from the first Starrcade where Flair won the belt for the official second time, you'll notice Soley, probably to the chagrin of the Crockett's and co-host Bob Caudle, kept making the statement that Flair was attempting to become a 3-time champion as opposed to 2. I'm in agreement that the Midnight Rider switch could just as easily be put in the screwjob pile, along with Starrcade 85 and 100 other Flair matches in the 80s, but I don't dismiss it, or the other changes, if you're simply basing it on the fact promoters didn't mention it. Especially when you consider there have been official switches in the past that have also been glossed over or even ignored by member promoters. Jim Crockett's territory never acknowledged Harley Race vs. Tommy Rich, Shohei Baba vs. Jack Briscoe or Baba vs. Race Quickies. When Rich and Baba would come to work on JCP shows, it was just mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that they were former world champions. The Kerry Von Erich title reign was also never mentioned on either Crockett or Georgia television. Of course, this was understandable because both groups were involved in the big co-promotion of a Meadowland show running opposite the WWF at the time, which was headlined by Flair defending the title against Ricky Steamboat. Crockett's shows did mention the switch several months later, and even showed a tape of the match from Japan where Flair had regained the title, with Wahoo McDaniel doing commentary and even stating that he had a hard time believing that the Kid ever beat Ric Flair. I'm guessing that was more directed at Fritz Von Erich than anything else. For what it's worth, the official NWA website now recognizes both Flair race switches in New Zealand and Singapore, and the Flair Fujinami switch in Tokyo as official title changes. They also make mention of both the Midnight Rider and even the Shane Douglas deal. It's understandable now that they would mention the first two since Steve Rickard and now Antonio Inoki sit on the board and this provides a historical link for these two countries, but I was mildly surprised to see the other two even brought up. I know it's easy to say that the NWA today isn't the same NWA, but again, from a totally legal standpoint, the organizations are one and the same. Having Rickard, the late Larry O'Day and now Inoki in the group clearly provides a direct historical lineage to the old regime. I wouldn't have considered the WCW International World Title an actual world title either if not for the fact that they did two switches in Japan between Rick Rude and Hiroshi Hashi. Remember the mysterious Lady Love? So that pretty well forces the issue in my mind. It is interesting to note that while New Japan only referred to it as the WCW International Heavyweight Title, WCW concocted a confusing storyline. That WCW and WCW International were two separate organizations, and that each recognized their own World Heavyweight Title, so it probably should have been called the WCWI World Heavyweight Title more than anything else. Either way, Tony Schiavone had to read a disclaimer on television after the NWA/WCW court case went down, disavowing any NWA sanctioning of the belt. Despite this, to this day they still falsely advertise that the NWA and WCW titles are one and the same on their website. So in my mind, the fact that a judge ruled on it in a court of law strengthens the argument that the Flair-Sting switch should be counted as two different title wins, and that Flair-Fujinami should count as well. As for the match between Steamboat and Flair, I always thought the reason a promoter would hold up a title was a way of ensuring the fans that they would be guaranteed seeing a new champion crowned. Not recognizing this one as a title change pretty much destroys the credibility of the gimmick, but seeing as this is WCW we're talking about, I guess I get your drift on that one as well. Finally, on a somewhat related note, with Naoya Ogawa's win over Dan Severn for the NWA title, Severn seemingly ends his reign in third place on the list of longest-running NWA champions. There seems to be some dispute over that as well. Most lists I see today have Harley Race beating Dory Funk Jr. on March 24, 1973. But every old program I have from that period listed as May 24, 1973. There is the matter of a couple of alleged hidden title switches between Lou Thez and Bill Longson in 1952, which, if true, would mean that Thez's first NWA title reign would be split into two 4-year-long reigns as opposed to the one 8-year reign he's always credited with. Richard Sullivan, Belmont, North Carolina. Response from Dave Meltzer: in regard to the Midnight Rider deal, I saw all the Florida TV at that time leading to and coming out of that match. After checking as mentioned elsewhere, it was on February 9, 1983. The tape of Geigel giving the belt back to Flair was shot in the dressing room after the match, so it was delayed in that it appeared on television in Florida 3 days later but actually took place that night. Flair pinned Ricky Steamboat the next night in Norfolk in an NWA title match. I guess to me, I don't consider it a title change unless the new champion at least goes into the ring to lose the match, which we've now learned also eliminates the Jovica match from the list, and I have no idea how to even acknowledge the Colon deal. Solely on Starrcade, referring to Flair going for his third reign may have referred to Ryder, and remembering watching Starrcade at the time, my assumption was that he was referring to the Ryder deal, but it also could have been the Colon deal or solely just messing up on the numbers on a live broadcast. July 5, 2004, the Ric Flair autobiography, To Be the Man 6 Years in the Making, was destined to be the most talked about wrestling book of the year under any circumstances, simply because of the subject. If you polled wrestlers, and for that matter most longtime fans in the US over who the greatest wrestler of all time would be, I've got no idea who would finish second. But while the nature of the label greatest of all time would have people debating until death who should finish first, there is no doubt if such a poll had done, who would get more votes than any for first. On their best day, there were wrestlers every bit as good as Flair, but none had as many best days. There have been a few at his level, maybe a few even better, on interviews. There were those with his charisma, and a few with more, although I'm not sure anyone but Hogan had his enduring charisma. There were bigger drawing cards, and those who were more influential to the history of wrestling. But as far as the greatest overall, at least as far as the North American scene goes, Flair would have more of all these categories than anyone else. It's a subject touched upon in the book only a little, mostly at the beginning. Paul Levesque, HHH, in the foreword, comes right out and says Ric Flair is the greatest wrestler of all time. In the second paragraph of the book, Flair touches on the subject saying, for the last 15 years or so, I've been told that I'm the greatest professional wrestler who ever lived. It is interesting the names he himself chooses to compare: Frank Gotch, Lou Thez, Bruno Sammartino, Vern Gagne, Gorgeous George, and Hulk Hogan, because of their wildly different qualifications to be the greatest. The book is going to be talked about for two reasons. The first is Flair talking about himself, and taking a far more critical look at himself as a person than you'd expect, or that we've seen in most any wrestling autobiography. You have a 55-year-old man who led an interesting life, looking back at himself, and making no bones about how much fun he had, and questioning if that was always the right thing. That's probably why the book has gotten such strong praise from those who had seen advanced copies. He talks about his excessive drinking and depression in the 90s, from his frustrations about how he was portrayed in WCW, as his self-esteem was tied to a business that is often not kind, even to its living legends. He talked in depth about how deeply he was affected by the declining health and, ultimately, the death of his parents. He second-guesses the decisions of his youth, his football prospects dashed by flunking out of school. One of his college coaches at the University of Minnesota, who later coached in the NFL, stated Flair was a good enough athlete to where he would have played in the NFL. This is not in the book, and Flair himself has always been reticent about bragging about his real sports ability. As it was, he never played a down of college ball. And he talks about the positives and negatives of living his wrestling gimmick 24 hours a day. Flair's nightly going out to have fun and being one of the boys, the ultimate in partying and women chasing, following in the footsteps of legends like Red Bastian and Ray Stevens outside the ring, led to a life, like Stevens used to joke, I packed 75 years worth of fun into my life, and that was before I turned 26. Stevens, who Flair copied his ring style from more than anyone else, lived fast, spent big, and was always broke. He was forced to wrestle long past his prime, because he had no other skills. He died penniless at 60. Flair was lucky enough to survive in the business to where there was far more money, and also made lots of outside business investments, some good and some bad. But there is a flip side to all that. He talks about his not being there for his first family and oldest two children because he was so busy being Ric Flair in the 70s, and it was a regret he learned from because you can see just how important it is to be there for his two current high school-aged children. He talks about what he was well known for in the 80s, when he'd make $5,000 in a week and spend $10,000, and his troubles with the IRS that his bosses had to bail him out of, and even having his driver's license suspended for a few years when he was world champion. And he talks about his profession, and his favorite and not so favorite opponents. Many of the stories have never been reported, despite his career being one of the most open books of anyone in history. While it was known he was adopted, his origins were largely unknown. To this day, he has no idea about his biological parents, nor has he ever seemed to care. He was part of a black market baby selling ring out of Memphis and sold to Dr. Richard Ric Flair and wife Kathleen when he was 3 weeks old at a location in Detroit. It is said his biological parents abandoned him, but later TV news reports on the ring have shown that many parents were told that their babies had died, and then they were delivered to rich families who couldn't have children. The Flyers, who were not particularly rich even though Doc Flair, who watched every penny, the opposite of his son, was a well-known obstetrician in Minneapolis. They renamed him Richard Morgan Flair, and raised him in Edina. MN. Researching for the book, he had no idea what his birth name was, and even when doing so, found contradictory documentation noting a first name of Fred and a last name of Stewart, Demery, and Phillips, with the latter being his most likely birth name. He goes through many of his most well-known feuds, in particular the late 70s angles with people like Ricky Steamboat, Wahoo McDaniel, Roddy Piper, Harley Race, and others, when the Carolinas went from being just another territory to what was considered at the time the hottest place in wrestling. He has details on the plane crash that could have been career-ending, or even fatal, and his detailed memories of what nearly ended his career before it got untracked, as well as his thoughts on why he's always said Tim Woods saved pro wrestling in the Carolinas. He told the story of the strange incident when he flew to Japan for a tour, then, suddenly, at Narita Airport, stressed out over a huge IRS bill, flipped out, got on a plane, and flew back home. For a day, this was a huge story in wrestling because nobody understood why someone would fly to Japan and then fly back, let alone missing high-profile dates, something Flair just didn't do. Flair had issues in Japan both before and later. But on the tour in question, Flair, drinking heavily, arrived in Charlotte, where Jim Crockett Jr. was waiting for him, basically grabbed him by the hand, and took him on a flight to Japan and accompanied him on the tour to make sure he made his dates. He no-showed a late 1987 tour. He may have been pulled by Jim Crockett, as this was not addressed in the book, which was the catalyst for Bruiser Brody, who had burned his bridge by this time with both All Japan and New Japan, getting back with All Japan, as Baba needed an emergency replacement. In 1990 it was Flair who wound up as the reason for All Japan and New Japan getting together for a few months when New Japan went to All Japan for help after Flair and WCW had a falling out and Flair canceled a Tokyo Dome main event against Great Muta. The angles leading up to the original Starrcade, which at the time was the second biggest U.S. pro wrestling undertaking in history, behind only the Ali Inoki fiasco with Race, were described in detail. It's well known how Vince McMahon Jr., in the midst of a wrestling war, destroyed Starrcade in 1987, and ultimately Jim Crockett Promotions. Maybe the latter is unfair a bit, since Crockett Promotions were so mismanaged by that point and being booked into oblivion by Dusty Rhodes, that even if Starrcade had gone without a hitch, the end result may have taken longer but would have likely been the same. However, it's not nearly as well known how, before most were even aware there was going to be the biggest wrestling war in U.S. history starting a month later when Hogan, Piper and Gene Okerlund showed up on a McMahon TV taping at the Chase Hotel in St. Louis, how McMahon Jr. tried to destroy the first Starrcade. It was well known that Race was going to drop the title to Flair in a cage match, since Flair had said he would retire if he lost. The night before, McMahon Jr. flew Race to New York and attempted to get him to jump to WWF, without dropping the NWA title. No question this would have made the first Starrcade, remembered as one of the legendary nights in wrestling, into a disaster. Flair believed this would have killed the NWA and Crockett Promotions. Killed may be too strong, because Flair had a great run as touring champion the next 2 years before most of the territories starting collapsing, and time would have undone a lot of the damage. But it would have done serious damage. Race, for the first time publicly, confirmed the story, claiming he was offered $250,000, but turned it down. Race described it as he wouldn't have been able to look at himself in the mirror had he done that to his NWA business partners, as he owned points in the Central States Territory as well as St. Louis, which had been down a little over the previous few months, but was only a few months removed from its most lucrative 5-year run in history. Race's book, if he goes in depth on it, could be interesting, because he ended up losing his ass on both promotions once the war began. But Race knew the game at that point, of what McMahon was up to. Still, he himself was likely blindsided weeks later, when McMahon got his company's traditional TV time slot in St. Louis on KPLR by offering the station $2,100 per week and 5% of the gate from every house show. No doubt McMahon would have brought Race in as champion, likely put the WWF belt on Hogan, and set up a major unification match in Madison Square Garden in early 1984, establishing Hogan right from the start as the undisputed world champion. There were also stories of Flair fighting depression throughout the 90s with the company he literally saved from its death. Had he jumped to WWF in 1988, Ted Turner would not have bought WCW and there would have been only one major wrestling company left, more than 12 years earlier. In that sense, Flair's historical influence ranks right up there with all but the elite few. Flair wasn't aware he was the deal breaker, and thinks when he negotiated his contract for $730,000 a year, as someone that integral, he could have gotten a lot more. That may not have been the case. Despite his legacy, charisma, ability, and popularity, he was abandoned as a headliner regularly, only to be brought back when others who were supposed to replace him couldn't handle the position. But it was difficult to book him. He couldn't be on top all the time, as it simply would have gotten stale. It was difficult to book him as a mid-carder, because he didn't like to win, but because he was always someone the company could go back to. Business was terrible more often than not, and Flair, coming from the era where the top guys got the credit and blame, probably felt it more than Sting and Luger, who didn't care as much. In late 1990, when Sting was christened the franchise star, a decision nearly everyone felt was the right one going in, he struggled on top because he couldn't do the championship interviews, or work the championship matches with other opponents that fans had expected from the standards Flair set. Plus, he often would follow Flair's match in the semi, and Flair was often still stealing the show. As to why it all happened, there are as many different reasons for each of the revolving door of administrations that ran WCW from when it was purchased from Jim Crockett in November 1988 to when it was closed down to America Online/Time Warner in March 2001. It was a few months before his 40th birthday when WCW was formed, and a year later, after probably the best year of his career inside the ring, management decreed he was too old and not marketable enough to be on top. Some in management in 1989, which turned out to be the company's best year until Hogan arrived, even blamed his being on top for the company's lack of popularity. His peers who gave him so much help when he was rising in wrestling were replaced by a new group of wrestlers. The standards of having to prove yourself to be a top hand and a ticket seller before you got the world title, a privilege few would ever get, were replaced by people who thought they were due the title because of how they looked, or it was simply their turn, since they worked hard. Flair became this guy standing in their way to the top. Yet, in the 12-year history of the company, he is, to this day, remembered as the face of WCW. He was its biggest star for years, and that was never more evident than during the 18 months when he worked for the opposition. It is a WWE book, so the story has to have a happy ending. Flair right now has the best of both worlds. He had lost his confidence, and after reading the book you really understand for the first time why he's always said he was personally glad the day WCW died, even though he felt sorry in the big picture for all the people who lost their jobs. Thanks to several of the people running WWE, and current running buddy Triple H, who grew up idolizing him, he was given one last chance in 2003 to be Ric Flair, with the forming of Evolution. Now at 55, when all the people who tried to run him off are almost all either out of the business, or out of power, he can get the last laugh because he's still one of the biggest stars in the game, although that also can change an instant in a youth-oriented company that changes its mind weekly. Among his peers, he is no longer thought of as a guy who won't go away, as his enemies in WCW painted him, but as a guy that everyone feels privileged to work with, because it's the wrestling equivalent of playing next to Michael Jordan, even if it's no longer Jordan in his prime. Some will see it as ass-kissing to Vince McMahon and Triple H, but those were his genuine emotions at the time, and he has had more fun being Ric Flair over the past year than in the 10 prior years combined. Like with all WWE books, you also have in-depth talk about money, what he earned in the Carolinas, as NWA champ, in the WCW years, etc., but not one word about his earnings in his 2 WWF runs. The other part of the book, which will be far more controversial, is his take on different people. For the most part, it's black and white, with a few shades of gray. The people you'd expect him to praise, like McDaniel, Stevens, Steamboat, Race, McMahon, and current running buddies Triple H and Shawn Michaels, get nothing but praise. There are the management people he had falling outs with who he felt didn't respect who he was, most notably Jim Hurt and Eric Bischoff, and wrestlers who, over the years, he perceived as having taken shots at him, that he was delivering a book full of receipts, like Scott Steiner, Bret Hart, Mick Foley, Shane Douglas, and in an interesting and even a surprising twist, Hulk Hogan. One of the last sentences of the book was among the most telling. Hulk Hogan could never buy what I have. As they have all gotten older, Hogan, like Vince today, and others, probably Flair as well, along with many others from Sammartino to Race to Billy Graham, naturally become more concerned with their legacy, and how they will be remembered. Flair recognized that after the past few years, within the profession, he, not Hogan, will be thought of by the boys and he insiders as the greatest of the modem era. Hogan started doing jobs, even to Flair, when he had the power not to, because he knew without it, he'd be viewed historically as a great drawing card, but a terribly selfish performer, which, in fact, he was during most of his WCW run and certainly the end of his famous WWF run. Hogan was a product of how a giant superstar was booked in the 80s, that is never losing clean. He was the ultimate example of a top guy, and the role of the company was to constantly feed him fresh new opponents to beat, which had always been the WWF formula dating back to Sammartino, and New Japan's formula for Antonio Inoki. It was a formula that worked for the McMahon family for more than 2 decades and there seemed to be no reason to change it at the time. It was simply what he learned about his character during his AWA, New Japan and WWF runs. When Hogan returned to WWF in 2002, his reputation in wrestling was so bad that most in the company were very negative about bringing him back. Steve Austin, the biggest star at that time, refused to even work with him. But Hogan read the landscape perfectly. He put over Rock in a way to get himself over. Soon, he was the hottest thing in the company. But then he was asked to lose and lose and lose. And, because his legacy was at stake with a new generation of fans and wrestlers who would know about his refusing to lose, he did, all the way until making Brock Lesnar a superstar. But that was the straw that broke the camel's back, as he grew frustrated and quit. He was supposed to come back to put Lesnar over in a grudge match return, but refused, unless, this time, he got his win back and the title for the second time that year. This forced a major booking change, Brock Lesnar's first babyface turn, way premature, and the revival of the career of the Dead Big Show as a heel managed by Paul Heyman. And then he came back months later, but only lasted a few months before quitting again after being mad about how he was being used and his WrestleMania payoff. That final quitting resulted in a major loss of respect from many of the younger wrestlers in the company, and resulted in those who were against him from the start gloating, "I told you so." But, at least for now, it also sealed the deal internally on who was the real legend, because it's now a McMahon family-controlled business, all about cooperation and being a team player as opposed to the old rules where the top draws looked out for themselves, and if the promoter didn't like it, they went somewhere else because there were always options for a real top draw. Flair described Hogan as someone who was motivated very differently, such as his need to beat Ultimate Warrior in 1998, and before that his grooming Renegade to be a superstar to lay down for him because he wanted people thinking it was Warrior under a new name, and he could get his win back. Perhaps his most clever knock was saying that Hogan was obsessed with this publication. While it's one thing to say that about Bret Hart or Mick Foley as a knock, which he did, it's doubtful either of them would consider that statement nearly the low blow Hogan would. Both have publicly acknowledged reading it and haven't referred to it negatively. Foley, perhaps ever, and Hart, not for many years. Hogan was a known Observer hater, as was Hart as one time, but that's another book, to the point he burned a copy of the Observer on a live pay-per-view because it has driven him off the edge. Few realized, and none would say so publicly, how closely he read about himself and how much it got to him. Despite all his money, as was pointed out, he was concerned that when he hung it up, what would be his legacy and where would he stand in the ranks of all-time greats long after the cheers of those who grew up when he was a fad were just faded memories. The funny part of it is, the internal business reputation means nothing in the long run as all old-timers who had success become legends, assholes or not. Nobody had a worse reputation inside the business than Buddy Rogers, and Argentina Rocca was hated by many power brokers. But today, the few that even care about those names only remember them in reverent terms. Flair, who copied Rogers and Ray Stevens, even acknowledged never wanting to wind up being thought of like the old-timers thought of Rogers when he came to the Carolinas in the 70s. Rogers, who at the time was older and not in nearly the overall wrestling condition Flair is now, worked a short program with the new Nature Boy, and put Flair over in a famous match, but Flair was constantly warned what a snake Rogers was. The Hogan-Flair dynamic goes back more than 20 years. Flair, 4 years older, became a star first. In the early 80s, Flair as NWA World Champion and Hogan as a mega draw in the AAA were, along with Andre the Giant and WWF champ Bob Backlund and Dusty Rhodes, the biggest drawing cards in the game. But of those, Flair and Hogan were the two whose stars were on the rise. Flair was the better wrestler and talker. Hogan was still years from getting his interviews down, but timing is everything, and Hogan was exactly what the public wanted in the early 80s. Steroids had been around since the 60s, and wrestlers were judged by how they looked dating back long before that. Still, big and cut-up guys were still rare, and while Hogan wasn't all that cut up by modem standards, he was a huge blonde and tan muscular specimen, the likes of which the industry, and for that matter most of the world, had never seen. The schedule, being on the road constantly, made it exceedingly difficult to eat right. GH wasn't around to get you cut while eating wrong. Flair, with the long blonde hair and the robes, a ridiculous amount of energy and ability, and being a master at promos, ranked right at the top when it came to charisma. But Hogan looked so big and powerful that he was almost perfect for both the wrestling fans and to attract non-wrestling fans. He was also learning how to play his character to become a hero to kids and sell merchandise like nobody in wrestling ever had. Until 1984, the only place they would have crossed paths was St. Louis, since they worked different parts of the country, and for different Japanese companies. There was no rivalry, even though anyone who could see the future could see in 1982, and maybe even in 1980, that someday there would be, and they would become the two superstars of the decade. But even though Flair first won the NWA title, the most widely recognized belt in the world, in 1981, no Flair vs. Hogan match ever took place in St. Louis. Hogan didn't show up in St. Louis until the summer of 1983. On July 15, 1983, both were in a tournament for the Missouri State title that was vacant when Race beat Flair for the NWA title 5 weeks earlier. Hogan, who by that time had stopped doing jobs, was eliminated in a double countout with Crusher Jerry Blackwell, while Flair beat Bob Brown, George Wells, Bruce Reed and David Von Erich to win the one-night tournament. Had Vince McMahon Jr. not decided to change wrestling and Hogan hadn't have jumped from Verne Gagne, it would have been an inevitable match in St. Louis in early 1984. Given the politics at the time, they would have likely done a series of DQ finishes. Hogan had already challenged Race for the title just before Race dropped the belt back to Flair on November 24, 1983 at the first Starrcade in Greensboro. And Hogan, no longer doing jobs, as the top stars of the era who made big Japan money like Andre Brody, Abdullah the Butcher and Stan Hansen were told not to do, forced his title match with Race to be one fall, ending with a DQ, because he wasn't losing a full clean. From 1984 to 1989, Hogan was the biggest star in wrestling, and in some ways, in its history, at least in the US, Flair was generally considered the best wrestler and top star for the smaller rival company, which in some ways had an even more fervent fan base because it presented a more realistic and athletic version of the product. Flair knew, with all the respect he had among the wrestlers and hardcore fans, that Hogan was a celebrity and he was just a wrestling star, and Hogan was earning many times more than he was. Hogan knew that when the final book was written over who was the best wrestler of all time, history may not be so kind to him, even if his bank account was, noting that it was Lou Thesz and not Gorgeous George or Argentina Rocca, who had the enduring legacy of being the greatest from the previous television boom era. Everyone would concede Hogan drew the money, but no matter how much he made and carried the business, and made others money, there was the specter of Flair, who in the long run would be remembered as the best wrestler of the era. There really should be no argument over who was better, because they are entirely different, and both were the best at what they were. Nevertheless, when Vince was on call-in talk shows, like Larry King, the question that was always asked in the 80s was, what about Ric Flair? Or what about Flair versus Hogan? Once on King, when it kept coming up, caller after caller, King went to Vince, you should sign this young guy Flair. Being a promoter in a war, there was only one answer, my guy would kill the other guy. Vince would scoff at the comparison, saying Hogan was 6'9" and 320 and Flair was 5'10" and 220, exaggerating on both sides. Still, when he finally got Flair, while there was the hesitancy to go all the way, and most feel any fan with a few years of booking knowledge could have booked Hogan Flair better than it was, it isn't like Vince took the war out on Flair. He made him champ twice, and Hogan never squashed him like at one point he probably wished he could. In 1991, Flair went to WWF after a falling out with Hurd, described in detail in the book. There is the irony of Flair knocking Bret Hart for refusing to put over his enemy Shawn Michaels in Montreal on his way out. Flair didn't even show up for the match with his buddy Barry Windham in the same situation, also because of a dispute with management, as opposed to Hart showing up to be double-crossed against his biggest enemy at the time. Flair claims he was going to do so, but before he was about to leave, got the notice from her that he had been fired, ending his run in WCW without ever dropping the title. As the WWF champion versus the real WCW champion, the program McMahon Jr. wanted 8 years earlier. At this point it was only hinted at in a storyline way but never pushed quite that strongly, but he and Hogan wrestled just about every weekend for 3 months. They were hardly all sellouts, although many did come close. Hogan's drawing power had taken a major hit the prior summer in the wake of the Zaurian trial. Flair was his best consistently drawing opponent in a long time, but the peak of Hulkamania was over. In many ways, Flair coming when he did took a lot of the negativity of Hogan from the Zaurian trial away, because Hogan-Flair was such a strong program on paper. If they had done a pay-per-view match, no doubt Hogan would have won. Although Hogan did pin Flair in many tag matches in 1992 when Flair was WWF champ, all the singles matches ended in DQ and count-out endings. After McMahon allowed Flair to go back to WCW, even though he was under contract, honoring a personal promise he made to Flair that he would let him out of his contract if he was going to move him out of main events, he wanted Flair to work semis and put over rising guys like Razor Ramon in early 1993. At the same time, Bill Watts made Flair a big money offer to return to WCW and be the top star in the company, and to this day many are shocked McMahon honored that verbal promise. But by the time Flair arrived, Watts was gone. Still, when Sid Vicious, who was being groomed to win the title at Starrcade '93 in Charlotte, was fired after a hotel room brawl with M. Anderson, strangely, when talking about this, the brawl story was never alluded to in the book and there was no explanation why suddenly Flair, who hadn't been pushed on top, was suddenly in the Starrcade main event. Flair had one of his biggest career nights, beating Vader for the title as a babyface in a very physical match filled with legitimate blows to the face, where he vowed to retire if he lost. Flair strongly recruited Hogan in late 1993 and early 1994, after Hogan and McMahon had their falling out. WCW made Hogan, who was largely out of wrestling by that point except for New Japan major shows, an offer the likes of which nobody in wrestling had ever received, including 25% of the company pay-per-view revenue for every show he would headline if company revenue topped $2.4 million. If not, Hogan would get $600,000 per pay-per-view event. Hogan and Flair were in WCW together from 1994, until Hogan finished up in the summer of 2000 after his falling out with Booker Vince Russo. They always worked together well, wrestled each other many times on both TV and pay-per-view, and in February of 1999, drew what was a last hurrah for the company, the final time it did a 1.0 pay-per-view buy rate. The frustration over Hogan double-crossing Flair in 1994, by not dropping the title back to Flair at a live Clash of the Champions after Flair had put Hogan over for the title in his debut the month before, did make the book. That was to lead to their third meeting, but when ticket sales were so disappointing for the live show in Detroit, the company panicked, and felt it needed to make the third 1994 meeting a career versus career match to save interest in the pay-per-view. Of course, this forced Flair into a short-term retirement that he didn't want to take. Still, Flair traced his real heat with Hogan, that he'd never gone public with, to January 17, 1999, at the sold-out pay-per-view in Charleston, West Virginia. It was David Flair's debut, teaming with his father against Barry Windham and Curt Hennig, two of his father's favorite opponents, even though both were past their primes by that point. David had not even trained to be a wrestler, but was rushed into the ring anyway, because that was WCW. The post-match angle was that Rick would be handcuffed to the ropes and Hogan would whip David 4 or 5 times with a belt. Instead, Hogan destroyed David with whip after whip. It wasn't fair to make my son go through that. He wasn't even really a wrestler yet, but there was nothing I could do. I was handcuffed to the ropes. I couldn't jump up and say, "Hey, don't do this to my kid." I wanted to, though. I felt like running over and holding David in my arms, and just stopping that stupid angle right there. He wasn't ready. David didn't say a word. He took it like a man. And then there was Hogan with all his experience, and all his celebrity trying to be cute. He whipped David like a dog. It was sickening, and 111 never forgive him for it. The book was ghostwritten by Keith Elliott Greenberg, who did the Freddie Blassie book, one of the company's best, and is expected to be assigned to the Billy Graham book next. Still, those close to the situation, including people who have had major heat with him in the past, credit Mark Madden, one of Flair's best friends for more than a decade, with doing a great job in the role of editor. It could have used one last bit of proofreading on some timeline stuff, as Flair's memory after 32 years of one-night stands isn't going to be perfect. Almost all the key stories were in their right time frame. A Flair Jumbo Tsuruta match 60 minutes draw with race at ringside listed in 1983 was actually a Flair win over Tsuruta in 1981. He and they should have been more careful with some of his Foley comments because comparisons to Brutus Beefcake are rightly being viewed negatively. The accuracy is overall strong. Like with the very strong book by Jack Briscoe released a few months back, all the 60 minutes draws as champion probably blend together and some 30-plus minute matches are remembered as 60s. Like almost every wrestling book which talks about the heyday of the territorial system, the term sellouts everywhere should be taken to mean a few sellouts and consistently strong business. Madden was involved in the project from its beginnings, as this book was delayed since 1998. First, it was delayed when the original company lost interest after its first wrestling project, the Bill Goldberg book, was such a huge financial disappointment. Then, when a second publisher jumped on board and everything was signed, Flair went to WWF. WWF wanted the book badly, and the new publisher which had a contract didn't want to sell. It seemingly took forever for WWF to buy the rights. The WWE also didn't at first want to use Madden, since there was tremendous internal heat on him, but Madden also had already signed a contract, and eventually it was worked out where he would be the editor. Worse, Flair was so busy that it became impossible to slow him down long enough to get him to work on the project. Then, first ghostwriter WWE assigned to the book simply had no idea of Flair's place in wrestling, and Flair didn't want to work with him, and remains bitter about it to this day. The book runs through Flair winning the tag team title with Batista in December, thus doesn't include his stuff from this year. It did talk about his heart problem last year, from the years of heavy drinking. He claimed in the book doctors ruled out steroids, always a touchy subject in WWE, as a cause. In the book, for the first time publicly, Flair admitted to having used steroids during his career, different from what he said publicly many other times. Other sources indicate Flair was told the heart problems were due to both drinking and steroids, although Flair himself believes it to be the drinking, which he did in far more excess than the steroids during his career. It forced him to curtail his often legendary drinking. In late 2002, when his health was bad, his performance was notably falling off. He had his only singles match ever against Rock, in Greensboro, on a live Raw. With the atmosphere and emotion, it should have been something special. Rock promised a classic, and while the crowd and Rock did their part, Flair could barely do his. It was actually quite sad, except that the crowd cheered Hill Flair against the most charismatic babyface in the game. There were nights with his health issues that few knew about, where he looked like a guy who needed to get out of the ring. Flair himself admitted disappointment in his own performance even in his 2002 pay-per-view matches with Vince McMahon and Undertaker, before his heart condition acted up, even though both were considered strong at the time. But when his performance hit rock bottom and he was being jobbed out, like the match with Rico when Rico was a manager, even worse than WCW ever did, his major concern were his heart issues, which looked at the time like they very likely could have ended his career. Fast forward to this past WrestleMania, and he and Rock put on a show that tore down the house, and he had improved so greatly his performance outshone the return of legends like Rock and Mick Foley. He was suffering from cardiomyopathy in layman's terms, his heart would skip beats. Doctors insisted he stop wrestling and drinking. He largely kept it secretive, and the WWE's internal injury and health report for talent never listed it, apparently out of respect for who he is. He'd work as a manager, and still take a few bumps during from the outside. It's questionable how many people in the company knew, as Flair himself thought it was only Vince, John Laurinaitis, and Jim Ross, although at least a few others high the power chain did know. Medication cleared up the problem months later. The book points to May 19, 2003 in Greenville, South Carolina, just a short time after his condition cleared up and he returned to the ring. It was the singles title match with Triple H on Raw, where he played aging babyface for a day going for one last shot. After taking the crowd through the roller coaster of nearly winning the title, he lost. Steve Austin, who loved the match and worked with Flair a few times in his final matches before walking out in the summer of 2002, remarked after that match that he considered Flair as still as good a worker as anyone in the company. After the show went off the air, Tommy Dreamer told the wrestlers to hit the ring for an unplanned celebration as they carried Flair off on their shoulders. Flair has called that moment the greatest of his career. To him, it was the wrestlers responding like the crowd in the same city on September 14, 1998, in one of the greatest moments in TV wrestling history when he returned to Nitro after a real-life legal battle with Bischoff. It was his vindication after years of being treated as anything but a legend in WCW. To have an entire locker room that grew up watching him, treat him like he was the ultimate in the business. It was quite different from the WCW locker room. Flair himself may not have known that there was a genuine plot to ruin him and get rid of him, particularly when Kevin Nash was in power. Nash, often among his close-knit group of friends, talked about getting rid of Flair and Roddy Piper in particular, figuring it would open up more money so his clique could get raises. In the case of Flair, it was seen by that group as revenge for Nash's buddy at the time, Lex Luger. Flair alluded to hearing about problems with Luger, but seemed not to be aware of why, and wrote nothing negative about Nash, so the odds are he was not aware of it. While many would claim Flair made Luger's career, Luger had a different viewpoint. Flair carried Luger to good matches from Luger's beginnings in Florida when he was terrible, and carried him in the latter stages of his career when he was also terrible, and often in between, when, with the exception of a year or two, Luger ranged from being mediocre to pretty bad. However, Luger never forgot that twice in 1990 and once in 1991, Flair was supposed to drop the title to him, and refused on all three occasions. He also felt he and Sting should have been the faces of the company, and blamed Flair never retiring for the reasons neither became quite as big as both were expected to become. The first two non-losses were because Flair had promised the title to Sting, who was out at the time after knee surgery. It made no business sense to lose the belt to Luger before the Sting match, because the Flair-Sting match was clearly the biggest the company was going to have all year. Even though that was obvious to Flair, or anyone who understood wrestling, those running the company didn't understand wrestling. At the time, enough of the higher-ups believed the company would turn around as soon as they got the belt off Flair, and simply couldn't wait the 2 or 3 months for Sting to get back. In 1991, he was negotiating for a contract extension in exchange for dropping the belt, and Jim Herd refused to give it to him. It showed me different mindset about what the belt meant to Herd, with little wrestling experience, as compared with McMahon, who lived the business. Vince McMahon felt so strongly that the fans needed to see the title change in the ring, WL, at least if the talent was leaving. And it's funny that McMahon himself never dropped the belt back during the week he was champion, that we saw the 1997 Survivor Series. Another time, when Jeff Jarrett's contract had expired the day before he was to lose the 1C title to China on pay-per-view, and he was jumping to WCW, McMahon paid Jarrett his demanded $200,000 in cash to show up for the last pay-per-view so he could have the title switch. And the world title was far more important in 1991 than the IC title when Jarrett held it, but Herd didn't understand wrestling. A month later, when it was clear he was really going to WWF, the 1991 Great American Bash turned into the first night of an 18-month-long fan protest of "We Want Flair" chants. Herd offered Flair far more than he was originally asking, to stay, and the belt was already off him. Even though it was far more than McMahon guaranteed, Flair by that point had given McMahon his word, and wanted to wash his hands completely of Herd. Even though WCW revolved around ratings, and during the Monday Night Wars, Flair, Sting and Bill Goldberg were the company's consistently biggest ratings draws, his $500,000 contract at the end was less than half of Diamond Dallas Page, Goldberg, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Bret Hart and Sting, let alone Hogan, who at least were pushed on top. But he also earned considerably less than Scott Norton, Booker T, Stevie Ray and Rick Steiner and countless others, which in the book you could see was something he had a harder time with. Once, in early 1998, when Flair vs. Bret Hart with a rushed build-up did a bigger buy rate on a show without Hogan than most Hogan shows were doing, the company decided to cut off the program and make Flair and Hart a team. Then, before they were to team, when the reaction to Flair was the strongest of anyone in the company, it was mysteriously dropped, and the two never even tagged up. Unlike most wrestlers in their books, Flair focused a lot on his family and on his finances, and how he screwed both up at times, but apparently learned from his mistakes. His youngest 2 children, who he's cheered on as they've both become local high school sports stars, Reed in football and wrestling, and Ashley in volleyball. He was more than humble about what he considered his bad matches, and times when he didn't feel he was himself. He's been fortunate of late to get preferential treatment. He works television, and some house shows. It's totally unlike the insane schedule he once lived, such as the night he rushed from a hospital in Minneapolis the day after son David was born to make a Raleigh TV taping. He was under the threat of being fired if he didn't come. Now wrestling allows him time for both the family life and the wrestling life. He even talks about his dressing room fight with Eric Bischoff, pretty much exactly how it happened, and noting it was premeditated and his real emotions leading up to it. That was surprising in a sense. Unlike many wrestlers in their books, Flair puts on no airs about being a tough guy, nor brags about his bar fights, even though, hanging around with the crowd they did happen. He even mentioned that in 1981, there was opposition to making him world champion on 2 grounds. Some promoters felt he was too small. Others weren't sure he was tough enough to defend himself in the event of a double cross. The funny thing was there hadn't been a real attempt at a double cross in an NWA title match in probably 25 years, and the world champion should be a real shooter but largely archaic by that time. But a lot of the promoters were very old, and others were ex-amateur stars, who remembered how the business once was and had a notion of what they thought it still should be. But by this time he was 54 years old, but was burning with rage for one thing after another, but particularly the 1998 lawsuit that cost him $200,000 in legal fees, his entire earnings that he made in 1982, his first year as NWA champion. In WCW, as it was falling, Bischoff made the statement in front of all the wrestlers about how all the guys need to realize how lucky they are, and that only 3 guys on the roster, Hogan, Randy Savage, and Piper, had ever drawn money. Flair was sitting there. While his name was never mentioned, and there were plenty of people in the room who had been draws at one point or another in their career, when the speech was over, everyone saw it as the biggest slap in the face to Flair, who was a huge draw at different points of his career. There were times where the Carolinas, with Flair as the top draw, whose largest cities were minor markets like Charlotte, Greensboro, and Richmond, was the hottest territory in the country. While even defenders of Bischoff admit that in this case, based on how he treated Flair in WCW, he probably had something coming. Professionalism has it that a performer doesn't beat up another performer backstage before a show, even more when both are the ages they were. Flair, by all rights, should have been punished, but when he talked with McMahon, who deep down had to harbor a ton of resentment for Bischoff as well, McMahon did nothing. Flair had to convince him that M. Anderson, who was guarding the door to make sure nobody walked in while the fight was on, didn't know what Flair had in mind. Vince may have been sympathetic to people hating Bischoff, but if he had an agent involved in a physical setup, it was more than could be tolerated in a corporate dressing room. Vince told Flair not to talk about it, because it set a bad dressing room example. Flair was banned from saying anything, and Bischoff simply denied it ever happened, but it's all there in the book pretty much as it happened. The Flair-Bischoff dynamics will be covered in upcoming weeks, as will Flair's thoughts on who he considered great, not as great as their reps, and why. And the pan of the book that has garnered the most talk, his receipts on those like, most controversially, Foley and Hart, who he felt were critical of him in the past, that he'd never publicly responded to. This is the end of this conversion. Be sure to comment and subscribe. See you next time.